Section 18. Timing of agency customer or client or no representation. That is the question. Timing is everything. By now, you should be noticing a pattern in this course. Agency problems usually do not happen because an agent is trying to do something wrong. They usually happen because the agent waited too long. Too long to explain agency. Too long to ask if the buyer already signed an agreement. Too long to discuss compensation. Too long to get written consent for limited dual representation. In Arizona real estate, timing matters. Arizona Commissioner's Rule R428-1101 requires a licensee to obtain prior written consent before accepting compensation from or representing more than one party in a transaction. Arizona law also allows the real estate commissioner to discipline a licensee who acts for more than one party in a transaction without the knowledge and written consent of all parties. The key word is prior. Prior means before representation occurs, before confidential information is shared, before the offer is written, before the agency issue becomes a problem. The open house question. Imagine you are sitting at an open house. A buyer walks in, loves the property, and begins asking questions. At first, the questions are general. How long has it been on the market? What are the HOA fees? Has the seller received any offers? Then the conversation shifts. The buyer says, "We really like this home. Can you help us write an offer?" That is the moment to slow down. Before you begin working with that buyer, you need to ask an important question. Have you signed an exclusive buyer-broker agreement or any other written agreement with another real estate broker? Do not simply ask, "Are you working with another agent?" A buyer may say no because they have only exchanged emails with someone. Another buyer may say yes because they toured one open house. What you really need to know is whether they are bound by a current written agreement. That question protects the buyer, protects you, and respects the professional relationship another broker may already have. The Realtor Code of Ethics. Realtors also have ethical obligations involving timing. Standard of Practice 16.9 requires realtors to make reasonable efforts to determine whether a prospect is already subject to a current, valid exclusive agreement before entering into a representation agreement. That means the question should be part of your normal process with every serious buyer prospect. If the answer is yes, you should not interfere with that existing relationship. If the answer is no, you can move forward with your agency conversation, explain your value, review the read, and then complete the BBEEA if the buyer wants representation. Explaining your value. This is also the perfect time to explain what you actually do as a buyer's agent. A buyer may think your job is to open doors. We know it is much more than that. You help identify their needs. You help them understand what they can comfortably afford, not just what a lender says they qualify for on paper. You search for homes that match their goals. You look for red flags before wasting their time. You review satellite maps, nearby uses, road noise, alleys, power lines, drainage areas, or other issues that may matter to the buyer. You help them compare properties. You negotiate price and terms. You coordinate inspections, lenders, escrow, insurance, deadlines, repairs, signing and closing. And maybe just as important, you provide emotional support during a stressful process. You are the hub of the transaction. You help smooth out bumps before the client even sees them. That is value. The compensation conversation belongs early. The timing of compensation is just as important as the timing of agency. Buyers must understand how your compensation works before you begin showing homes. They need to know that compensation is negotiable. They need to understand that the seller may agree to pay some, all, or none of the buyer-broker compensation. They need to understand that if the seller does not pay the amount agreed to in the BBEEA, the buyer may be responsible for the difference. This is not a conversation to save for later. If you wait until the buyer falls in love with a property, the conversation becomes uncomfortable. If you explain it at the beginning, it becomes part of the professional relationship. Full disclosure before limited representation. Timing is especially important with limited dual representation. If the same brokerage may represent both buyer and seller, both parties must receive full disclosure and give informed written consent before limited representation occurs. This is why agency should be explained at the listing appointment and again during the buyer consultation. Sellers should understand that another agent from the same brokerage may bring a buyer. Buyers should understand that they may become interested in a property listed by the same brokerage. If that happens, limited representation must be handled before the offer is written, not after. Not when the broker reviews the file. Not at closing, before. A practical Arizona example. Let's say a buyer calls on one of your signs, they ask a few questions about the property and decide they want to see it. At the showing, they decide the home is not right for them, but they like you and ask if you can help them find something else. At that point, they are asking you to provide professional services beyond the single listed property. That is the proper time to stop and explain agency. Ask whether they are already under a written agreement with another broker. Review the READE, explain the BBEEA, and discuss compensation. If you skip that step and spend the next month showing homes, you may have created confusion, implied agency, and potential compensation problems. A 5-minute conversation at the right time can prevent a major problem later. Good timing builds trust. Consumers do not expect you to know everything, but they do expect you to explain important issues before they become surprises. When you discuss agency early, buyers feel informed. When you explain compensation early, buyers feel respected. When you ask about existing agreements early, other brokers' relationships are respected. When you get limited representation consent early, your file is cleaner and your client is better protected. Good timing is not just compliance, it is professionalism. Broker tip: make agency timing part of your script. Before you begin providing buyer representation services, ask whether the buyer has signed any written agreement with another broker. Explain your value, review agency, and discuss compensation. The earlier you create clarity, the easier the transaction becomes. Online discussion question: why is the word prior so important when discussing limited dual representation? Answer: prior means the written consent must be obtained before the licensee represents more than one party or accepts compensation from more than one party. Waiting until after the offer is written or after the file is reviewed can create compliance problems. Question: why should agents ask whether a buyer has signed an exclusive agreement instead of simply asking whether they are working with another agent? Working with another agent is vague. A buyer may not understand the difference between casual communication and a binding written agreement. Asking about a signed agreement gives the agent better information and helps avoid interfering with another broker's relationship. Question: why should compensation be discussed before showings begin? Answer: buyers need to understand how their agent may be paid, whether the seller may contribute, and whether the buyer may be responsible for any difference. Discussing compensation early prevents surprises and builds trust.